Welcome to Realizing Resilience, a podcast from the Connecticut Women's Consortium. We're not behavioral health professionals, but we're your gateway to real conversations with the experts. Each episode, we'll delve into the vast landscape of mental health, from personal stories to expert insights. Together, we'll bridge the gap between clinical expertise and personal experiences, connecting with diverse voices and perspectives. Join us for insightful conversations that demystify the world of mental health.
Ed has been a clinical social worker for over 25 years, working in residential, hospital, and outpatient clinical settings. Ed is employed by the Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, otherwise known as DMAS, serving as the director of the General Psychiatry Division at the Connecticut Valley Hospital. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Realizing Resilience. I am Marisa.
I'm Alana.
And today we have the pleasure of speaking with Ed Renaud. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. Could you, as to kick this off, kind of give us a brief overview of attachment theory?
Well, sure. So attachment theory in 2024 really covers a wide range of concepts and ideas, ranging from developmental psychology to social neuroscience. And so it's a huge topic which finds its origins really in the work of a British psychoanalyst who was named John Bowlby. And John Bowlby was somebody who worked in the Tavistock Clinic during the 1950s and 60s. One of his formative experiences professionally was working with children who had been relocated from the cities in Great Britain to the countryside. You may recall that during the Second World War, Great Britain was under a period of sustained aerial assault from the Germans. And so as a way of protecting kids, they relocated those children out to the countryside where they would be more safe and in places where they weren't being targeted. And so John Bowlby's early influence was in working with those kids who had been not only relocated from their homes, but separated from their parents. And one of the things or amongst the things that he observed was a certain series of responses that these children would have. And so one of the responses that they would have is initially anxiety, which you might obviously expect, you're being separated. And sometimes that response was followed by anger, which then be followed by sadness. And so, Dr. Bowlby was a very empirically minded fellow and had placed a great deal of emphasis on biology and the basis of behavior in animal survival, a term which is called ethology, and really sort of pose the question of, why do human beings actually even engage in attachment behavior? Why do we as primates and mammals form social connections? And, his basic answer to that was really for survival. And so, because if you look at human babies compared to other animals, human beings are born, uniquely or almost uniquely dependent on caretakers for survival after they're born. We're not gazelle, that are up and walking, minutes after birth. We don't hatch from eggs and just start crawling around. We need a lot of help. We need a lot of support after we're born in order to survive. And one of the things that attachment does, at least in the early stages, is really sort of foster and cement those bonds with a caretaker to help us survive. Because we are social animals, that bonding behavior, that social behavior, that attachment behavior has a lot of positive impacts and positive influences on childhood development and later adult behavior in terms of pair bonding of various sorts and forming social groups for mutual benefit, survival, or just plain fun. So in terms of attachment today, that sort of kernel of what started with, looking at kids who've been separated from their parents during wartime has developed and deepened and expanded and, evolved into a set of ideas seeking to understand really the nuts and bolts of that sort of social connection and the underlying psychological, biological apparatus by which, this incredible thing of ordinary human experience sort of, grounds itself in. It's a long answer to a short question.
I loved the history lesson. That was great. It is true with kind of in comparison to humans and animals, and even our gestational periods are even a lot longer than most animals too. And you're right, there are a lot of animals that they're born and they're walking. They know how to eat already. They know how to do these things. They're not as dependent.
we're pretty high maintenance as animals go, in terms of our young. We need a lot of help and a lot of support. It took a number of years. I mean, so John Bowlby wrote in the 1960s and early 1970s. He published a lot. I mean, he wrote a lot of papers, but the three books that attachment theory is sort of most commonly referred to with is a 3-volume set. One which was entitled Attachment. The second one was Separation. The third one was Loss. Each sort of representing sort of the 3 stages of the attachment response. And he and colleague of his by the name of Mary Ainsworth did a lot of work, primarily with kids, but other people have taken, these basic ideas and expanded them to adolescents and adults. And because attachment behavior doesn't stop when you hit the age of 3 or 4, it is something which influences us throughout our lives. He had some difficulty persuading some of his contemporaries about some of his ideas, but over the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen really a renaissance and an explosion of these attachment ideas being taken up in psychology and psychoanalysis, and particularly in child welfare, which some of us as social workers are more familiar with. And again, even sort of the quote hard sciences of biology and physics, where taking a look at really sort of the neuropsychiatric, the neuronal origins and roots of this social behavior. So it's really it's a window into what makes us social creatures. It's a window into how your internal mindset impacts the internal mindsets of the people around you, and vice versa, and how does that conversation take place with not just one person and another, but whole groups, families, communities. So it's a window into what makes us human, and it's an exciting, interesting, fascinating thing to try to understand a little bit more.
I agree with Marissa. I think the context and the history is an important part of the conversation because, like you said, there's been this renaissance, and I think it's expanded even into like the consciousness of pop culture. There's a book about attachment theory that got pretty popular within the last few years, and it seems like it's been kind of like a pop psychology topic. So I think it's important that we explore the nuance of it a little bit more too.
There are various topics within mental health and psychology and psychiatry that take on a certain cultural cachet, for better and worse. And the good part about that is that people get exposed to the ideas. The bad part sometimes is maybe a little nuance gets lost, and you want people to dig a little deeper. There's a lot from Sigmund Freud that gets tossed around, culturally, which if you ask experts, they'll quibble with, and attachment and other theories kind of follow suit around that. So, on balance, I think it's a good thing for there to be a general sort of sensibility, if you will, that the way we become connected differs from person to person, from context to context. It's all a way of deepening our understanding of one another, which is a good thing, particularly at this moment where we are so cut off from one another through technology or politics or distance. I think in general it's a good thing for people to have a good understanding or to be looking for an understanding of that.
And that's a pretty beautiful segue into our next question, which is, and I know that this kind of generalizes it a bit, but how do attachment dynamics kind of impact how people relate to one another, and how is it addressed in a therapeutic context?
So, there's a couple of different schemas for classifying attachment, which I won't go into in much detail. I'll talk about that in the seminar coming up in a few weeks. But most generally, attachment dynamics, they set the expectations that we have for ourselves about the social world. And they set the expectations that we have for ourselves, for other people, and what we anticipate will occur in our social interactions with other people. So it's an old idea that one's early experiences, people with the environment, just generally, sets the stage for one's experiences in adulthood, developmentally, that is. That things that happen early in life tend to be formative with respect to things that are expressed in that come out in behavior later in life. There's wiggle room in that. I mean, there's the notion of temperament and sort of some biological sort of original settings that we all come into the world with, that are somewhat independent of the environment that we find ourselves in. But hearkening back to this notion that we are born very dependent relative to other mammals, we do a lot of development of our brains and our bodies in the environment into which we are born, which means that relative to other animals, our biologies, or at least our brain biologies, are shaped in a particular way by the environment that we find ourselves. It's one of the reasons why we're so successful at adapting to so many different environments. Our attachments, the way that we what we expect of being connected to other people, has a way of shaping the way that we choose to engage or not engage. And so this becomes particularly important for people who've experienced psychological trauma, because their expectations, and particularly psychological trauma related to the actions of other people. And so, people get traumatized through things that have nothing to do with people, plane accidents, car wrecks, things of that sort. A lot of the people that we work with in clinical practice, at least within the area of mental health, have experienced traumas that have been related to, or perhaps even rooted in, their interactions and relationships with people, often with people who are very important to them. And so when those relationships that you depend on, rely on, want, desire, are also a source of fear or conflict. Now, we're human beings. We live in a social world. Negotiating, differences with other people is part and parcel for the course. I'm talking about something that's an order of magnitude different than that. I'm talking about things that are, the experience of physical or sexual abuse, the experience of domestic terrorism, and or spousal or partner abuse, the kind of hostage taking that kind of goes on with those kinds of dynamics. Those kinds of relationships, or even just the experience of living in an environment where there's constant physical danger. Thinking about certain environments where there is considerable violence within the community, can be enough to shape your expectation of what other people are likely to do or not do. You may experience other people as being unresponsive, or not likely to be supportive to your needs, or to your even to your safety when you need them to be. And so what does that mean? So who do you trust? Who do you depend on? With whom do you feel safe? These are all very deeply rooted needs in all of us. I mean, again, we're social creatures. Well, one of the ways in which social creatures survive is by depending on one another. And if you don't have people that you feel like you can depend on, we feel very isolated, and that doesn't feel very good. And the reason it doesn't feel very good is because we are creatures who need one another. And in the absence of that, we feel a loss. We feel the absence of something that's really important to us, for emotional support, for physical support, for survival. I mean, for Bowlby, a lot of it came down to survival, but we all know that there's so much more to that. That sense of being connected to people, that sense of belonging. So attachment plays an enormous role in that. Now, one of the things that has become more fully understood in recent years is that, attachment's not a fixed, immutable thing. And that the way in which we attach to other people can be very context dependent. And, the way that we attach to one another around sports teams, or the way that we connect to one another around, sort of affiliation through school or work, versus, an intimate partner, can look and be very different, depending on those different contexts. And also, I on balance think this is a really good thing, through the course of the lifespan, and good experience, good treatment, styles and characteristics of being attached, which might be a little bit more isolating or self-protective in response to an environment which may have been antagonistic or even toxic, can be modified to be more open, to be more accepting, to be more engaged with others. So just because we had difficulties early in our life, we are not doomed to have difficulties later on. It's not easy. It takes work, just like everything else. But attachment's not fixed. It's not. It is tractable. It is changeable. Is modifiable, and that's a hopeful thing.
Yeah, that's true. And to think of us as social beings that need a group, and then they need somebody to kind of support them in a time that can feel really isolating, whether by distance or remote working or, whatever. It's really interesting how that the social situation has changed to even distance us further than from those that we actually need. But it can bring us closer together too, with technology and things like that.
Well, right. I mean, this is, I'm sitting here in Middletown. You guys are in Hamden. I mean, this would be like a half day trip, back in the before time. This is before, for this technology. So, but yeah, I mean, there's actually a lot of interesting literature on sort of live interaction. And so there's so much more than the head about about the body. The head is actually attached to something, and it's larger, and we pick up signals and pick up all kinds of interesting information, which is very relevant to our understanding of the social world through body language, all these things that we kind of know intuitively, but a lot of that gets lost in these kind of virtual spaces. And so while it certainly it brings us closer together in certain ways, it's different. And what that difference looks like, what that difference results in is something, that's the experiment that we're all participating in right now, and have been over the last 3 years and will continue to. I don't think we know exactly what that is going to look like for us.
And speaking of in-person connection, you have a training with us at the consortium in person that will be happening called Attachment and Trauma. That's on March 21st. And what can participants expect to learn from this training?
Sure. First of all, I'm just so glad we are doing live trainings again. I can tell you as a presenter and as a teacher, it's a very different thing to teach before a live audience than it is to teach virtually. Everything's got its place. Everything's, there's value. I just happen to be one of those, maybe reflecting my age, that I really do like the experience of being able to see people and sort of be in the same room and feel that energy and whatnot. So I'm really glad that we're doing live trainings. I'm thankful that you guys invited me. In terms of what people could expect, we'll spend some time talking about attachment theory, so sort of the 101, some of the stuff that you might have gotten in your college undergraduate class in psychology with a little bit more depth, talking about how we classify attachment. There's a couple of two really sort of systems for classifying attachment from a research standpoint. The hope is anytime you go to a training that you're sitting in a room with somebody for a couple of hours, then there's your own reading, there's your own curiosity. So trying to give people sort of a grounding that in their own sort of learning journey, they sort of know sort of what certain concepts and ideas mean as they learn more about attachment than what they'll learn over the course of a few hours. So we'll talk about attachments classification. We'll talk a little bit about the biology of attachments, sort of things that we've learned about the brain and sort of areas of the brain that respond to certain types of social content. Some of the neuropeptides that are involved in that. We'll also talk about a concept or a set of concepts called mentalizing, and basically what that refers to is our ideas about other people's subjectivity, keeping other people's minds in mind. So how do we imagine the internal states of others, which is, one of those things that we do on autopilot, one of those things we do automatically to greater or lesser degrees or in different kinds of ways. It's an essential part of navigating the social world. And there's a lot of interesting ideas around how attachment influences one's ability to imagine the minds of other people. And so we'll spend some time talking about that. There's really sort of three legs to this presentation. The second leg is really to review, some of the fundamentals of trauma. And, a lot of your audience are going to come in with that information, but, it's important to talk about the stress response system and talk about, again, some of the biology, the HPA axis, things of that sort. Also some contemporary ideas about sort of what differentiates trauma from a stress response. What's that line? Because that line is different for different people and in different circumstances. Why is X event a trauma for one person and perhaps not a full trauma, but just stressful for another person? So what are the things that go into that? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And the third part is really about, what do you do with this stuff? What do you do with this stuff with people that come into your office, with the patients that you treat? I work in a hospital. We use the word patient sometimes. What does that mean for the people that we serve? At least in my view, attachment and trauma, represent two very important strategies for dealing with stressful situations. And so with attachment, you're really looking at a long-term survival strategy. I mean, we prosper by being connected to people, both physically and socially. And there's very good evidence, even biologically. I mean, people who have good friends, people who are in, long-term relationships, there's real health benefits to that. There's lots of good things for your body about being emotionally connected. Whereas the stress response system and things that are related to trauma are really a short-term survival strategy. How do you get out of danger? How do you stay alive? And in many ways, attachment sometimes gets eclipsed under conditions of significant trauma, because long-term survival strategies are a luxury that you only get if you're able to stay alive in the short term. And so what happens to attachment when that short-term survival strategy, that stress response strategy, is always on and doesn't turn off? What does that mean for our use of attachment, or the way that we engage in attachment when you don't expect the world to be responsive or welcoming? So we'll spend the first part talking about attachment proper, then the third talking about trauma, and then the third talking about what do you do with this stuff. That's what you guys can look forward to hearing.
Yeah, that's an incredibly comprehensive and well thought out kind of way to block out all that information. I think it's going to be really helpful to a lot of people who come. So I'm very excited to hear this training. I'm glad I get to work here and experience all these trainings, because I definitely learned things that I never really considered before.
Well, you guys do a real service to the mental health community by providing these trainings and giving people opportunity to be exposed to ideas that they can then bring back to their settings. And it supports the larger mission of the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, which is where I work, and the private nonprofit agencies that are devoted to working with people who need our help. And so thank you for hosting these trainings. Thank you for being really sort of a major sort of epicenter within Connecticut for providing this education and this professional development for us all.
Thank you for thanking us and helping us contribute to being able to help people.
I think we're both very happy to be able to contribute to that. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Links will be in the description to sign up for Attachment and Trauma on March 21st and to keep up with us at the Connecticut Women's Consortium. Thank you for joining us today. I'll see you next time. Be kind to yourselves.